data room, a due diligence pack, etc., and effectively try and solicit bids in that manner as opposed to kind of unsolicited bids.
Yes. I know that each of the options you explain is motivated by the ups and the downsides to it. We don't have to go there. What I want to understand is, did Eskom respond to you about each of these options?
Not in as much detail as we would have liked or hoped. I think certainly not formally. I think at one point there was the infamous comment around option 2 where we don't want the bakery when we can get the bread. But certainly, as far as I recall, there was no formal response to what we did in terms of that.
What I find interesting is that the third of the 3 options you propose make it quite clear that the asset can be sold through a competitive bidding process. And yet what happens thereafter is that there is a set of unsolicited bids.
That's right.
Inconsistent with the proposal. My sense is that the third option was eminently reasonable, consistent with Eskom's obligations to promote a competitive procurement process. Don't misunderstand me. I understand that this was not an asset of Eskom, but Eskom had an interest in it.
Absolutely.
So the third option was a fairly reasonable one, having regard to Eskom's obligations. The moment you as Optimum begin to engage with unsolicited bids, did you inform Eskom about them as and when they were coming through?
I don't recall the timing of when we did, but as they progressed to a point where we were comfortable that we could engage with Eskom, we did that.
All right. Can I take you through to those unsolicited bids? You address them from page 9,
yes,
paragraph 28.1.
Yes, so I mean, I'll run through maybe as briefly or as much detail as you want.
Yes.
We'd received an offer from a company called the Wunderland Mining Corporation, and there was, as I said...
I'm sorry. Did we change the page where we were? Did we move backwards? Or?
Yeah, we moved backwards to the statement. Yeah, page 9.
Okay.
And Chair, remember, we have now established that negotiations are closed.
Yes.
We have now established that Mr. Marsden set out the 3 options. We have now established that Eskom did not meaningfully engage with or respond to him about those options.
Yes, yeah.
Now we look at what he is doing in the light of Eskom's non-responsive attitude.
Yeah.
So the first party in paragraph 28 is Wunderland Mining Corporation, and there's quite extensive negotiation around terms, conditions, etc., and what would be acceptable to us. Nothing really came of that. I don't think that they were able to adequately satisfy ourselves that there was sufficient. The second one, which is the African Exploration, Mining and Finance Corporation, which is effectively the state-owned mining corporation.
Which state-owned entity is that? I mean,
I believe it sits, and I stand under correction, but I believe it sits under the Department of Energy as an entity. But it's the state-owned mining corporation. I think it owns Alex Core, amongst other assets.
Okay.
They're currently the bidder in round 2 of Optimum. It's current business rescue, so for interest's sake more than anything else.
Were you reading from page 9? I thought
yes,
you said paragraph 48, and I can't see 48 on my page 9.
Sorry, 28.
28, okay.
Yes, page 9.
Okay, all right, thank you.
So obviously a pre-qualified candidate, one would have assumed, with the backing of the state. But they withdrew from the process for a number of reasons, amongst other that Eskom had requested to record its intentions in respect of OCM, and then they disappeared. We had some meetings with a company called Joe Singh Group of Companies, and after one meeting, they too withdrew from the process. And then perhaps the most relevant in 28.4 is with the Pembani Group of Companies, which, as you have mentioned, was well known to not only us, but also to Eskom. They were a minority shareholder in Optimum Coal Holdings. And we actually got to the point where we signed a term sheet with them and effectively afforded them the opportunity to exclusively look at the acquisition of OCM.
Yes, and I mean, Pembani knew the asset very well, all things being equal.
Very well, yes.
They had dealt with the asset since they became the shareholder in 2012, if I'm not mistaken.
I assume at some
Yes,
time prior to business
Yes.
rescue.
But anyway, you indicate in 28.4 that ESCOM indicated its unwillingness to support the Pembani bid.
So we engaged with Pembani directly, and then they had an engagement with ESCOM.
Yes.
We were obviously not party to that engagement, but they did record that in a letter to us, which is annexure, sometime after they had withdrawn from the transaction. So we weren't immediately aware of why they had withdrawn. That only became apparent when they issued us that letter some few months later.
Chair, the letter is at page 133.
Thank you.
You have read the letter. I'm not going to ask you to deal with it, but the point is that ESCOM was not willing to support that deal, correct?
Absolutely. I mean, it's quite clear in the second to last paragraph, ESCOM was not prepared to amend the OCM coal supply agreement or waive its rights to enforce the claim under the coal supply agreement.
Yes. Did they explain to you why ESCOM was not willing to support their bid?
They did not.
And then in paragraph 29, you deal with the only remaining
Yes.
bid.
Yes, so I think importantly to note that when we contracted with Pembani, we did it on an exclusive basis.
Yes.
So we had at that point in time told the Oak Bay to get a consortium that we had found an offer that we thought was more appropriate, and we had terminated discussions. When that transaction failed, we were then left effectively to revert back to the last remaining bidder in terms of the unsolicited process.
Yes.
That's correct.
And then the bid was made through KPMG, of course.
That's right.
And we know that KPMG were the statutory auditors of the Oak Bay group of companies, correct?
I believe so, yes.
It was unsolicited, but what I want to establish from you is how did the statutory auditors get to know that this sale may well be up for sale?
I think that the Optimum matter was quite widely publicized in the media. We certainly didn't go out with any formal announcement around the sale process, so that aspect I can't comment on. But as I am aware, and as I'm sure you are aware, they were interested in acquiring the asset even prior to business rescue. So I presume they thought the timing was appropriate.
And then you responded to the KPMG's letter expressing the offer on behalf of Oak Bay or Together, correct?
That's correct, yes.
You deal with your response in paragraph 32.
Yes, that's right. We were seeking quite a lot of clarification around the offer. I think it's also important to note that at this stage in time, I was wearing two hats, one as the OCH practitioner, one the OCM practitioner. At this point in time, we were engaging merely around OCM. As I said, OCH was a non-trading company, it didn't have creditors, and the stay that we given from the moratorium effectively dealt with both the banks and ESCOM's potential claims. So at this stage, we were dealing very much in the OCM capacity. So we sought to clarify a number of items, specifically that OCT, a sister or brother company, i.e. owned by OCH, would not form a part of this transaction.
Yes. My recollection is that at that point in time, OCH had several subsidiaries. One was Optimum Coal Mine.
Yes.
Next was OCT. And the last was Gorfontein.
That's correct. There were a couple of smaller
Others.
but yes, those are the three main subsidiaries of OCH.
Yes. The offer that you were engaging with at that point in time, the Tegeta offer, to which subsidiary did it relate? I mean,
It related exclusively to the OCM, the mine,
The mine only.
the mine only.
All right. And that's the premise on which you engaged?
Absolutely.
With
And that's
it.
the premise on which we engaged the previous buyers as well.
Yes. And then what was the response of KPMG insofar as you were dealing with that offer? I mean, did they come back to you to say, look, their clients accepted or they rejected? I'm just trying to establish how far the negotiations progressed.
So we got to the point of a non-binding term sheet
Yes.
after some correspondence, which essentially sought where OCH would sell its shares and claims in OCM with a whole bunch of considerations. Principal, once again, was Eskom's consent, a due diligence period, and there were a number of other ancillary sort of terms that had been agreed between the parties.
Do you remember what was the purchase price at that point in time?
It was a rand.
A rand.
Yeah. I think further to that, there was some assumption of debt within OCM that hadn't yet been clarified that would be dealt with post due diligence, but essentially the value that OCH would receive for its shares and claims would be 1 rand.
On the face of it, it looks for someone like me a laughable offer, but it was serious in a sense that they assumed liabilities.
Absolutely. I think that it would have to deal with the very present 2 billion or just north of that claim, as well as, of course, the funding obligation going forward. The
Yes.
mine was still at that stage loss-making to a considerable degree. So if you buy an asset for a rand, there's generally a reason for it.
And I'd like you, if you can, take us through the financial implications of that 1 rand deal that Tegeta would be assuming at that point in time. My recollection is this, that at that point in time, OCM had a banking facility
That's correct.
to the order of 2.5 billion rand.
That's correct.
So Tegeta would be assuming that liability of,
So maybe just a slight clarification.
yes,
The 2.5 billion was an OCH facility, but of course, banks being banks, they had security across the organization.
indeed.
So they had security not only of the assets, which they had perfected in OCM, we were effectively acting as their agents, they also had cessions of the shares in OCT and in Quinfontaine as well.
Yes, but it is a facility that enabled OCH to fund.
That's correct.
And that's the reason why, ultimately, when OCH sold the 3 entities, it had to settle its portion of that facility, which was something in the order of 400 million rand.
So the purchase price was contributed to by 2 parties. Ultimately, we're talking about the
Yes.
final transaction.
Yeah.
There was a purchase price that was delivered from, essentially from
Tegeta.
Tegeta for the
2.1 billion.
Correct. And the 400 million rand was a contribution made by Glencore in order to ensure that the banks were paid in full, such that the assets would be released, if that's where you're heading.
That's where I'm heading to.
That's correct, yes.
Yes. So for that 1 rand, they will be assuming at least portion of that 2.5 billion.
Correct, and I think that's recorded in the term sheet where we record that there are banks that have security over the assets, and post due diligence we will have to apportion how much of that pertains to OCM.
Yes,
Because of course a portion would pertain to OCT and Quinfontaine.
indeed.
Indeed.
Then they'll be assuming a potential liability for the penalties of 2.1 billion.
That's, I mean, yes, there is within the term sheet a endeavor by both parties to try and resolve it, but ultimately there would be a liability that would accrue and would be part of that.
We know that on that letter you have read from Cliff Decker Hofmeyer, Eskom was quite clear about those penalties. They were not negotiable, they had to be paid immediately without delay, correct?
That's correct.
So any new buyer for 1 rand would be assuming that liability.
That's correct, although in the term sheet we had agreed that there may be an apportionment of it.
Oh,
But
yes.
yes, there would be for sure a portion that would be due by the new buyer.
And lastly, that buyer would be taking over the prospective penalties.
The forward-looking losses and the prospective penalties, absolutely.
Yes. On your approach at that point in time, and the reason for you to stop it was you supply coal at 1 rand per ton.
At this point in time, we were in the interim supply agreement, so we were back to the 150 rand. But even in that context, there is significant losses. So one can debate whether it's the 1 or the 150.
Well,
there are massive losses.
let's assume that it's 150.
There are massive losses.
The cost of producing coal for 150 per ton was higher.
Significantly, yes.
So they will be assuming that liability too.
Absolutely.
Having regard to those at least 3 identifiable levels of liabilities which Tegeta would be taking for R1, I suggest to you that you need a strong balance sheet to carry that liability for the life of the mine or for the life of the CSA.
Yes. I think that, remember, Eskom's position with regards to the penalty, we interpreted as in the context of having Glencore as a shareholder. So we thought that there was the possibility that it could be renegotiated, but in the event that they stuck to that position, you would need an organization who could meet those financial commitments.
Oh yeah, with a strong balance sheet.
Absolutely.
Or parental support.
A strong balance sheet?
Yes. And I suggest to you that Tegeta did not have that balance sheet. That's the reason why it would have went to Eskom to procure a guarantee to secure the purchase price. And that's the reason why it would have gone to Eskom to secure a prepayment to fund the balance of the purchase price. On any basis, they did not have that balance sheet.
I know chronologically we're a little bit out of order, but certainly we had similar thoughts. And when the ultimate transaction was concluded, so this was kind of a preliminary and then it moved, and I'm sure we'll cover that ground. But the fundamental point remains in any context. The ability to fund the purchase price and continue was, of course, a concern of ours. And as a result, we had requested a demonstrable evidence of funding available at that point to conclude the purchase of the business. And we were shown a document, but I'm sure we'll get there.
We'll get there.
Yeah.
What I'm suggesting to you is that even at that point in time, you must have had your doubts about
Indeed.
the funding ability of Tegeta
Indeed.
to meet such liabilities.
Yes.
Yes. All right. Can we then look at your statement? Chair, I'm back at page 12.
Yeah.
You were explaining how you were dealing with that offer of Tegeta,
Yes.
and you could summarize or read out the whole or portion of 34.1 up to 34.3.
So whilst we were engaging with Tegeta, we of course were attempting to engage with Eskom at the same time. So despite Eskom's unwillingness to engage with OCM, we continue to update Eskom. In early November, we reminded them that they played a key role in the rescue of OCM. We further advised that we had secured additional funding for the month of November and thus had limited times and funds to conclude a transaction. Eskom did not comment on any of the options that we've just discussed that were available to us. It merely confirmed that it was willing to meet with representatives of Oak Bay to consider the veracity of its 10th of September offer, and we acknowledged that as well.
And in paragraph 35, you say that Tegeta then requested you to arrange a meeting with Eskom, and that meeting was held on the 25th of November, correct?
That's correct.
Can I ask you to deal with that meeting? Firstly, did you attend the meeting?
I did attend the meeting, indeed.
What about your colleague, Mr.
Mr. Van den Steen was there.
All right. From Eskom side, who attended the meeting?
Mr. Koko, Ms. Nteta, I believe Ms. Daniels were there. I think it's reflected in the minutes a
Yes.
little bit further, and Sean Blankfield from Glencore.
Yes, we can go to the minutes. They're at page 148 and 149.
Mr. Mabelani, Ms. Nteta, and then, of course, representing Oak Bay, Mr. Hauer, Mr. Chwala, and Ms. Ragavan.
All right. When I look at the minutes, it seems as if you were doing a lot of the talking.
I am prone to that.
Then the most important part of the minutes, and again subject to your guidance, which I would pick up and ask you to comment on, is at page 149. and I'm going to read these and ask for your comment. The chairman, who was Mr. Koko at the time,
That's correct.
emphasized the ESCOM position, which is ESCOM's priority is security of supply. Do you see that?
Yes, sir.
We'll come back to that in a moment. There is a coal supply in place until 2018. ESCOM expects Optimum Coal Mine to honor the contract at the contracted price until 2018. ESCOM will not waive its penalty claim. That was his view.
Yes.
What I find odd with this position, it's a matter which I wanted to comment on, is you cannot insist on security of supply in relation to an asset which you know has already indicated via its managers, you especially, that you cannot supply at that rate, correct?
That's correct.
That position itself imperils the security of supply.
Indeed.
What was your response to ESCOM's position?
I think that we had, on numerous occasions, I don't want to use the word threaten, but they interpreted it as such. We had clarified that in the event that we don't find a solution, that very issue would come to the fore. To the extent that we run out of options, and as we've been through, our options had greatly diminished over the last few months. If we got to the point where we had no options, we would be obliged to place the company into liquidation and, of course, imperil the supply in that way.
Yes. Mr. Hoa and his colleagues from Oak Bay were there, present.
They were.
They must have heard this unwavering position of Mr. Koko,
They did.
that ESCOM will not waive
They did.
the penalty. So they would have engaged with you on their offer on the strength of that knowledge that ESCOM was not going to waive the penalties, correct?
I think we didn't really get an opportunity to have a discussion because the meeting then moves on effectively to attempt to address that, and the whole structure of the transaction effectively changes as a result of what happened subsequent to the meeting.
No, I understand, but if we take Mr. Koko on his own words,
Yes,
they were present, they heard what he said,
they did.
and they would knew what ESCOM's position is
That is correct.
in relation to the penalties.
That is correct.
The question of how it changes and why it changes is something that we'll deal with later. But
Yes.
at that point in time, when you had arranged a meeting at the request of the very same persons, they were told what ESCOM's position is, correct?
That is correct.
Then there is something new which is introduced, which was not part of the offer of Oak Bay. It relates to the two subsidiaries, Korenfontein and Old City, Optimum Coal Terminal. Those are assets which were outside the offer. How do they get raised for the first time in this meeting in relation to the desire of Tegeta to discuss their offer with ESCOM?
So Mr. Koko raised the issue that, much as you've raised and much as we all understood, that OCM as a standalone business was likely to be in the context of a non-renegotiated offer, which has been made now clear on several occasions, would be loss-making, and it would require, as you said, a balance sheet in order to support that. The current position was that ESCOM already had a guarantee from OCH, and as such, it would have the ability in the event of a default to pursue that guarantee to OCH and effectively then follow the money down to either Korenfontein or OCT in terms of a recovery of the amounts that would have been due to it. So there was a proposal made at the meeting by Mr. Koko that rather than consider a transaction of just the bad part of the business, if I can use that common vernacular, to rather expand our scope and look at not only OCM, but at Korenfontein as well as at OCT, which were, in certain contexts, the good aspect of the business.
I'd like you to be clear on your recollection of the discussions at that point in time. Are you suggesting that it is Mr. Koko who raised the issue?
I absolutely believe so, and I think it's recorded in the minutes as well.
So it is not the buyer who's raising the issue?
It is not.
Okay.
1 second. Zonaka. we may proceed. Thank you.
Chair, if there's anything you want us to help with, we will definitely do.
Yes, no, it's something that needs to be sorted out by the protectors and administration.
Oh.
Yes, thank you, thank you.
Thank you, Chair. We now know that Mr. Koko raises the question of the other assets and not the buyer.
Yeah. If I can read from the minutes.
Yes.
So it is on page 260, the second paragraph right at the bottom. He, and in the context of this, he refers to Mr. Koko, postulated that if OCM were to be ring-fenced, Eskom was not convinced that it would survive on its own, and hence he was compelled to engage in a discussion regarding OCT, not OCM.
Yes. Can I take you forward to page 149?
Yes.
I'm sorry. Mr. Marston, just before you read it, did you say page 260?
No, sorry, I've got a different referencing. It is 149, my apologies.
Okay,
Chair.
we must just use the same. I
My
was
apologies,
trying
Chair.
to see where you're reading from now.
So it is the second paragraph. The paragraph opens with "he noted that," but
Yes.
I'm reading the last sentence of
Okay,
that
thank you,
self-same paragraph.
thank you.
He postulated that if.
Then he raised something about Tegeta's financial strength. Can you read the minutes?
Yes. So it's slightly before the paragraph or the sentence that I've just read. He further questioned the financial strength of the new buyer. Firstly, would it be able to sustain a loss of 134 per month? And secondly, how will the buyer survive without the Quinfontaine contract and the export allocation?
Yes.
So it's, yeah.
The key part of his concern at that point in time is that it was clear to him that absent any form of increase in the asset base for sale, quite clearly Optimum coal mine itself was running at a loss.
Correct.
And that loss, on his own estimation, was 130 million rand per month.
That is correct.
So he is telling the prospective buyer at the meeting that you are buying a loss-making asset of 130 million rand per month.
Correct.
You have to be a strong person
Indeed.
of the greatest faith in commercial realities to acquire an asset at a loss of this significant proportion.
I agree.
Okay. And he suggested that there had to be a pairing of the Quinfontaine asset as well as access to the export allocation contract, which is OCT.
That's correct.
Yes. Can I ask you to explain to us why OCT as an asset was an important issue that could have increased the financial fortunes of a buyer?
Absolutely. I think the importance of OCT is that it has an allocation through RBCT of approximately 6 million tons. Quinfontaine itself had its own allocation of just over 1 million tons as well. What does that mean? The export of coal is an extremely lucrative business in South Africa, and the gatekeeper of that and the access to export markets is largely as a result of access to the Richards Bay coal terminal. So if one has coal and no export allocation, it doesn't really help you. So the ability to access that very important strategic asset is fundamental, and that in itself has significant value. So whilst OCT is largely a non-trading entity, it simply has the rights, it could sell those rights for very handsome reward on an ongoing basis.
So Optimum Coal could export coal using the terminal to the extent of 6 million tons.
It could export its own coal, and or it could sell that allocation
Yes.
to any other miner who wishes to use the allocation to the
Indeed.
tune of 6 million tons.
Indeed. So I, as a trader, could approach OCT and say that please take out my exports to the market and I'll pay you a fee.
Correct.
Yes. Okay.
And it's a very lucrative allocation.
And I mean, you do nothing. You don't even lift a finger to earn such.
There's some paperwork that you push, but yes,
Yeah,
in
but
that
just-
context.
Yes, yes. It does not involve any significant overheads.
No, it doesn't, or risk.
All right. What then was your response to Mr. Koko's idea that those two assets must become part and parcel of the sale agreement? And secondly, in the light of his concern about the lack of financial strength of the buyer to absorb the loss of OCM as a standalone.
I actually thought it had quite a lot of commercial merit.
Yes.
I think that through the guarantee, Eskom already had the ability to access those good assets, if I use that in inverted commas. So to retain the structure in place made commercial sense. And I think at the same time it solved the problem that you've put and the problem that he suggested around the buyer's financial strength. Because any transaction that involved both Quinfontein and OCT would support any losses that were made at OCM. So the proposal had merit. I was surprised that it had been done because it could have been raised previously. So I was certainly surprised at the proposal, but pleasantly surprised because I thought it had commercial value.
Yes. Were you surprised that the new buyer did not see the commercial sense of it when it made its offer?
Just for a correction, their first offer was not there. They then subsequently did make an offer on that basis. So I think they must have seen the commercial value. So quite shortly after this, they made a further
No,
offer.
I'm saying at that point in time, before they revised the offer.
I think they must have seen the commercial value in it, yes.
Okay. For the first time as a result of that meeting.
Yes.
Yes. And then you deal with the question of the debt to the bank. I'm still at page 149.
Yes.
The paragraph following the one you had just read.
Yes, so the bank consortium the debt had grown as a result of interest and post-commencement finance, so it was at a higher amount than you would recognize from earlier on. And any transaction would require equally their consent to the extent that they were not fully repaid.
Yes.
And as a result, they were the secured creditor, they had access to the assets, etc. And so any transaction, whether it be at OCM or OCH, would require some level of consent from the banks.
And you say that was a senior debt of 2.7 billion rand secured in favor of the banks.
Yes, they had security over the fixed assets, they had a cession over the receivables, they had a pledge over the shares. As you would anticipate with banks, they had pretty much everything.
Yeah. Chair, you'd recall how the banks do tie you up. They even own your income. They even own your assets. You can't do anything.
Yeah.
I would step off the minutes unless you would like to say something, but maybe let me direct your attention to the second last paragraph and the last sentence of that paragraph under Roman 3.
Sorry, are we still on 149?
Yes.
Yeah, I think the last sentence is really fundamental, is that Nazim Hauer confirmed that Oak Bay was dealing with it from OCM perspective and that it did not have a mandate at this point, that's me paraphrasing, to talk regarding OCH, which was the proposal by Mr. Koko.
Yeah. But he raised few issues before then about whether there were negotiables from the side of Eskom, correct?
He did.
And one of them relates to penalties, correct?
That's correct.
And can I ask you to deal with his issue relating to penalties? You'll see it under Roman 3.
Yes, he had asked whether Eskom would consider a waiver of the penalty, and unsurprisingly, Eskom replied back that it was clear that Eskom was not prepared to waive that penalty claim.
Yeah. All right. We can leave the minutes on the clear premise that what was clear to the parties in that room at that point in time was the penalties would not be waived. there may be a restructuring of the offer in order to include 3 assets.
That's correct.
And the banks would have to consent to the sale because of the secured senior debt of 2.7 billion.
That's correct.
All right. Now, I'd like to take you back to your statement
Yes.
in order to trace the developments thereafter.
Yeah.
And you deal with those developments from page 13, paragraph 36.
Yes. So just to recollect the timing, because I think it is important, the meeting that we've just referred to, the minutes, was held on the 24th of November.
Right.
So very shortly thereafter, on the 26th of November, in the context of a completely restructured deal, a surprisingly short amount of time, Together made a new offer. This offer included the sale now of all of the assets of OCH, i.e. not just the shares in OCM, but in the other subsidiaries, including OCT and Quinfontein, for a purchase consideration of 1 billion rand. This was not a written offer, it was communicated to me by Mr. Efron.
All right. We heard the evidence of Mr. Clinton Efron in relation to how Glencore responded to that offer, and he said it was rejected.
I have a slightly different recollection. Whilst they did certainly reject it, given the context that it would have required the bank's consent, I also had arranged a meeting with the bank consortium, and in the context of a purchase consideration of 1, they would have written off 1.5, given their total exposure was that. And I received a very curt response that that was not an acceptable offer. So both Glencore and the consortium of banks rejected that proposal.
Yes. All right. I don't think anything turns on it. We know as a fact that that offer was rejected.
Yep.
And then what was the next phase of the development? I think you begin to deal with them from page 14, paragraph 38.
In paragraph 40, or earlier than that, sorry. Where would you
Earlier
like
than
me to
that,
pick up?
from
Yeah.
paragraph 38.
So taking back to the context of the offer has now been rejected. On or about the 30th of November 2015, I received a call from Mr. Efron requesting that I attend a meeting. I did such. And I was informed at that point in time that Glencore had received a number of notices from the Department of Mineral Resources stopping operations not only at within the OCH stable but at other Glencore operations. And as a result of that, Glencore had effectively reconsidered its position and the view that the 1 billion was certainly not sufficient value. And they had made a fundamental decision to essentially declare the business rescue process a failure, if I could use that terminology. They would continue to support OCH and OCM. They would discharge the company from business rescue once they'd gone through some of the governance steps, and they would live with the contract until the end of its term in 2018.
Yes. We'll get to the details. Mr. Efron testified about the notices, and I think other witnesses too testified about the notices. And they took the view that they were too harsh and represented some form of pressure, but from a different quarter, and that was DMR. I wonder whether you took a view about the purpose behind those notices.
I think I would concur with that view.
All right. Then I'd like to get to the details of this fundamental shift of
Yes.
Glencore in relation to its asset at Optimum coal mine.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a fundamental shift.
It is Glencore essentially acceding to all of the demands that Eskom have made and that they've stuck to, as we've recalled on several occasions, that kind of firm line in the sand. We're essentially having Glencore saying, you know, this last couple of months has really not worked out, and we would seek to discharge the business rescue and to live with the contract on Eskom's terms until the remainder of 2018, which is a fundamental shift.
I mean, we heard his evidence, and it is quite clear from his evidence that from May 2014, when he came in, he came in, it was quite clear that neither Optimum Co. itself, the holding company, would absorb the laws. And therefore, they had to do something fundamental. And they could not carry on under the CSA as it was structured. And for that reason, they declared a hardship. The penalties even added to the difficulties they had. And for that reason, they decided to place this mine and the holding company into a business rescue. At this moment, when Eskom was quite clear that it was not going to give a quota, they now shift and concede to each and every demand of Eskom by taking out this company out of business rescue, by telling Eskom that they will supply on the same terms of the CSA, which previously they considered oppressive. Correct?
That's correct.
Why would Glencore all of a sudden get to this Lazarus moment?
I really think that that's a question they should have answered, but I think the context is we were running out of options. The last bidder had put an offer that was not acceptable. There was external pressure which may or may not have impacted their other businesses. And as a result, they had an internal meeting and decided to do an about turn and pursue this process.
What? You do indicate in paragraph 41,
Yes.
on page 14, that fundamental change in position was communicated to Eskom.
That's correct.
Can I ask you to deal with how Eskom was told of the change in stance?
So immediately after Glencore had informed me of their intentions, I was requested to facilitate 2 meetings in a very specific sequence. First, they had requested that I set up a meeting with Eskom, which I did, and they immediately thereafter wanted to meet with the banking consortium. So if I can deal with the first meeting was held on the 1st of December. It was attended by myself, Mr. van den Steen, Mr. Coco, and 2 representatives from Glencore. And at this meeting, Glencore effectively recorded that the offer had been rejected and that Glencore, would continue to support OCM going forward, and that OCM and OCH would be discharged from BR, obviously pursuant to some governance that had to be achieved first. It's not something that can be done immediately. And then they confirmed further that it would not seek an amendment to the CSA, and it would pursue arbitration proceedings for the resolution of the penalty, and it would also not insist on an extension of the supply agreement with Eskom at the Koenfontein mine.
All right. I suppose that this meeting was not recorded because you don't favor us with any minutes or notes of the meeting.
No, it was an informal meeting. I do think that, I don't think the contents is disputed.
Yes.
I certainly recall from Mr. Coco's evidence at the parliamentary inquiry that he records very similar happenstance at the meeting.
We will come to his position because it becomes fundamentally important. And you're quite correct that he did make submissions and testified at the Portfolio Committee's hearings.
Yeah.
But what I want to confirm with you at this point in time is that when Mr. Efron communicated that position to Mr. Coco, Eskom must have been surprised by this, correct?
I would hope pleasantly surprised, yes.
Indeed. Because whatever it insisted upon up to that point in time had been conceded by Glencore.
Exactly. Their hardball tactics and holding the line appeared to have worked.
Yes. The consequence of it is this, that on Eskom's hard line and the concession of Glencore, Optimum would be running at further losses for the lifetime of the CSA, which was 2 years more, correct?
Correct.
So if one does simple mathematics, from the perspective of Eskom, it will be 130 million rand per month multiplied by 24 months.
That's correct.
From the perspective of Glencore, it will be 150 million rand multiplied by 24 months.
Correct.
Yes. Chair, at this stage, I would like to introduce documents which are not in these files because they reflect how Eskom dealt with this change of position. They are going
Well, I'm sorry, before you proceed, did you, Mr. Marston, did you ever get to know what had informed Glencore's fundamental shift? Around that time, did you get to know, or is it something that you might have got to know much later?
I certainly asked the question at the time.
Yeah, I would have expected you would ask, yeah.
And I think I was aware of the Section 54 notices. At the time, Glencore, and still remains, a very large organization. Whilst these numbers are extraordinarily large for ordinary people, the Glencore is a large organization, and I suspect that as big as the losses are, as illustrated between 130 and 150, depending on whose versions, Glencore could have sustained that loss. They had the balance sheet in order to do that. What it would have done is twofold. It would have protected the OCT, and they would have retained that allocation, which at the time, with coal prices quite depressed, was not as valuable, but where they are at the moment certainly would have been. And I think Glencore would have seen through that cycle of prices. Secondly, I think that come the 1st of January 2019, at the end of the CSA, there would have been a very interesting negotiation around an extension. So I think they took the view that we can quantify what that range of costs is, and in the context of the last remaining offer being R1 billion, the maths just didn't work, and in the context of perhaps pressure on the 54s and impact on the other business, they could factor a risk element into that.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Chair, can I, with your leave, hand up these documents? They're already in the bundle of documents we introduced at the beginning of the Eskom hearings.
Okay.
But we thought it wise just to extract
For convenience.
for convenience, rather than to ask you to bring the whole set of files here.
Registrar.
Yes. Can you give? Thank you. Chair, as a matter of convenience, these documents were extracted from volume 4 of the transcript of the parliamentary proceedings, and you'll see that each of the pages at the top has been paginated.
Yes.
It is the pagination which starts with 1499, which is relevant for the present purposes. And,
Yeah.
and the evidence of Mr. Marsden in relation to these documents is going to become important when you hear the next witness, Dr. Ramucha, because these letters were addressed to him.
Yes.
So it's a very useful introduction of Dr. Ramucha's evidence before he even takes the stand.
Yeah.
We have placed documents before you, and I'd like to identify them with the pagination which begins with ES, okay? Have you seen ES 1499 before?
I may have seen it as part of Mr. Koko's testimony, which I kept a keen eye on.
Yes. I'd like to orientate you about those letters. ES 1499 appears to be a draft. Okay. And then if you go to ES 1501, you will see that that is an email from Ms. Suzanne Daniels to Mr. Koko. It is dated 6 December 2015, 7:55 p.m., and it is addressed to Mr. Machela Koko and Ms. Norman, who is very astute and diligent about the calendar. She tells me that that must have been a Sunday. And thereafter, you would see there is ES 1502 and 1503. That document appears to be an updated version of the previous document. If you compare the two, in other words, if you compare ES 1499 and ES 1502, you will see that the second page, page 2 of that letter is longer and therefore has additions which the previous letter did not have. But other than the additions, the contents of the letters are the same. So the deduction we make, Chair, as the legal team, having regard to the email from Ms. Daniels, is that ES 1502 is an updated version of the previous draft.
Which is ES 1499.
Yes.
And was ES 1501 a kind of covering note for 1499?
We assume that this ES 1501 was an email from Ms. Daniel telling Mr. Koko that he has updated the draft.
Yes.
And that update is the one which is signed by Mr. Koko in ES 1502 and 1503.
Yes, the 1501 is on the 6th of December 2015 at 7:55. And then 1502 is signed by Mr. Koko on the same date.
Yes.
Yeah.
The previous draft, 1499, is not signed at all.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
So we will work with the document which Mr. Koko has signed, because that's the one that he used to make submissions to Parliament, and that's the one that he introduced in the parliamentary evidence. So if you don't mind, I'll ask you to go to page 1502. Are you there?
I am, but if I could make one comment before we disregard 1499.
Yes.
Timing is everything in life. And there is one other sentence, if we could just focus on as a distinction between the two letters before we get into the content. So if we go to 1599, it says, at the recent meeting of the parties 2 days ago.
Where are you reading
So I'm sorry, my apologies, it's 1499.
Oh, second paragraph.
Second paragraph from the bottom.
Yeah.
At the recent meeting of the parties 2 days ago.
Yes.
The meeting was held on the 1st of December, so one can assume that the genesis of this letter was the 3rd of December, and I think timing is important. That then changes in 1502 at the latest meeting of the parties, and obviously given the inflection of time, it's changed, but it's an important distinction for me.
All right.
Okay.
Thank you for that distinction. But I understand from your evidence that the last meeting you had with them was on the 1st of December.
That's correct.
There was no other meeting after that.
There was no other meeting, no.
Yes. So whether it is the recent or the latest, from your perspective, we must work with the date 1 December.
Yes.
2015.
The only distinction was that there was a monthly update report, a standardized update report that was submitted critically in that interim period.
I understand.
Okay, so
But that was a report,
it was not a meeting.
Yes.
Exactly.
So we can work on the basis that as far as you're concerned, recent or latest, the date must be fixed as 1 December 2015.
Correct, absolutely right.
But some of these things may be significant for different purposes. That paragraph from which you read, which suggests that there was a meeting two days previously on what has been indicated, you have indicated the last meeting was on the 1st of December, before these letters. And so either different parties are intended, or if it's intended, the same parties are intended. If the same parties are intended, then maybe the author was just mistaken about the date of the meeting, or if it was not mistaken, there may have been other purposes for stating things in a certain way.
If I can maybe explain why I want to make the distinction, that probably would clarify. And I presume we're heading there, so I don't know if I'm going into the unknown here. But I did watch Mr. Koko's testimony at the parliamentary inquiry, and he seeks to discredit, is maybe the only word that I can think of, this letter state by the fact that in the 4th of December, there was an update report that came in, which was a generic update report. So that's why the intention behind this letter started prior to that update report, and that is merely a red herring. So that is why I make the distinction. The letter further says, in the latest meeting, there was no other meeting. So the advocate is absolutely correct. It still records the latest meeting. We are referring to the same meeting.
Yes, but also the meeting, at the meeting of the 1st, isn't the position that at that stage ESCOM was being, ESCOM was being informed that Glencore would take OPM out of the rescue process, business rescue process. So it's not as if it was out of that process already.
Correct, and there's some governance around how one exits. So that is part of the reason why we couldn't immediately discharge it. The principal reason being the bank debt had accelerated and we needed to restructure that. And then there are further governance issues that the practitioner has to satisfy himself that Glencore has provided sufficient funding. So there's, whilst we've said we're going out of business rescue, we had not yet achieved the task. And I think that's the distinction I wanted to make.
Yes, because the letter says that the business rescue practitioners indicated that Optimum was no longer in business rescue. So at that meeting, you could not have put it that way.
Correct. Our intention was to discharge it, but we hadn't yet done the act.
The fundamental shift had just happened.
Exactly right.
Okay. Thank you.
All right, Chair, just to reinforce your point, if you put 1499 side by side with 1502, and you reflect back to that paragraph, the second last paragraph, you will see that 1499 is shorter than its mirror image on 1502.
Yes.
The sentence that I'm going to read from 1502 has now been added. It was not there previously on 1499.
Yes.
The sentence is, and I'm reading the second sentence from that penultimate paragraph, they further advised that they will follow the contract route to process ESCOM's claim of 2.2 billion rand. They made it very clear that they are not insisting on the extension of the Koorfontein coal supply contract with Eskom. They insisted that the extension of Koorfontein coal supply contract is at the discretion of Eskom. This was not previously in the draft.
That paragraph.
Yes.
Yes. Yeah.
Right. I'm sure, Mr. Marsden, around the 6th of December, you were not aware of these letters.
Very much not.
Yes. I'd like to take you to 1502 because it reflects Eskom's position to the stance taken by Glencore at that meeting of 1 December 2015. And forgive me if I were to go through paragraph by paragraph.
No problem.
This is Mr. Koko writing to Dr. Tibedi Ramuncha, who's the next witness we're going to call. Do you know why he is writing to DMR?
I have no idea.
Okay. He says, and as he starts, as you may be aware, Eskom has been involved in a legal wrangle with the above supplier from about August this year. Don't worry about that. We will take that up with Dr. Ramuncha. Next, he says, in a rather dramatic fashion, the company was placed under business rescue, and Eskom was faced with intermittent veiled threats of liquidation, while at the same time, the business rescue practitioners purportedly sought constructive engagement with the parties. You see that?
Yes, sir.
Was the initiation of business rescue process or proceedings by Glencore dramatic, as far as you are aware?
Not in my view. I think they had made it quite clear prior to making the decision that that was a possibility, and they had let Eskom know about it.
And they had engaged Eskom about that prospect before?
Correct.
Yes. So there was nothing dramatic as far as you are aware. And then they say that you had purported constructive engagements with Eskom. We have gone through a series of what you had done to engage Eskom from August, when you took over, up to the point when you received the final offer of Tegeta. Would you describe those negotiations as a reflection of purported constructive engagement?
Certainly not. I think that we sought on many occasions to try engage with Eskom. So from our side, it certainly wasn't purported. We sought actively to engage in constructive engagements. Whether the engagements themselves were constructed is an entirely different question, but I would lay the blame in that regard on Eskom rather than ourselves. We genuinely attempted to engage with them.
What I find surprising about that description is that it does not disclose to the Director General the chapter and verse of those negotiations. Correct?
Correct.
And yet it puts a description on the qualitative nature of those discussions
Correct.
in a manner that is not consistent with the true nature of those discussions.
Correct.
I'm going to read the next paragraph. From Eskom's perspective, it was expected that as a Glencore operation, Optimum coal mine would enjoy far more support than the conditional funding for limited time periods that was on offer. I hope I understand what he's conveying there, but let me ask you first. Do you understand what he's conveying to the Director General?
I do. Glencore had been providing us post-commencement finance throughout the business rescue. Given where the banks ranked in the security profile, any funding that Glencore provided was largely lost and would, in all likelihood, not be recovered. So they were essentially providing that on a monthly basis in order to see how we had progressed initially in our negotiations and subsequently in the conclusion of a transaction.
The point I'd like to establish from you is that by the time this letter was written, which is 5 days after the meeting,
Yes.
Glencore has made it quite clear that they're going to provide far more than a financial loss.
You're absolutely right. At this point in time, Glencore had given me the assurance and had given Mr. Coker on the 1st of December meeting the assurance that they would provide sufficient funding to see it through to the end of the contract.
All that was required of Optimum Coal Mine to meet its obligations under the
Correct.
CSA,
Exactly right.
including the question of dealing with the penalties.
Exactly right.
Yes. Again, that was not disclosed to the Director General in this letter.
Correct.
The next paragraph reads as follows. Optimum supplies one of Eskom's key contributors to the national power system as Hendrina Power Station is a stalwart of Eskom's fleet, supplying approximately 2,000 megawatts to the national grid. Glencore was fully aware of the dynamics and history relating to the nature of the coal supply agreement and its structure when it concluded the sale with its previous owner. That is a fair reflection of the true state of affairs. Then when Glencore bought the mine from Bexa, correct?
Yes, it seems to be correct.
We had Mr. Efron's evidence. They were aware about what the CSA at that point in time, I think it was, Bexa bought it in 1993 from Transnatal. They bought it in about 2012, I think.
Sounds about right.
From Bexa.
That's right.
So I think he's reflecting the truth at that point in time, correct?
Embedded, of course, in the supply agreement is the hardship, so yes, it is included in there.
What I want to understand is...
It's a fair reflection.
It's a fair reflection,
Yes.
okay. The next paragraph reads as follows. At the latest meeting of the parties, the business rescue practitioners, together with the Glencore representative, indicated that Optimum is being rescued and that it would honor the contract in its current form with no amendments. They further advised that they will follow the contract route to process the Eskom claim of 2.2 billion. They made it very clear that they are not insisting on the extension of the Koorfontein coal supply contract with Eskom. They insisted that the extension of Koorfontein coal supply contract is at the discretion of Eskom. Again, he is reflecting the truth.
That is a fair reflection of the meeting. Yes.
As a matter of detail, when did the Koorfontein coal supply agreement come to an end?
It was slightly different in that it was a volume-based contract, not a time-based contract. Details aside, sometime in January 2016, so very presently.
Okay. The next paragraph reads as follows. Eskom is perplexed by this about turn, given the events of the past few months, and at the blatant disregard Optimum displays for the impact that the threats of liquidation has on the precarious balance of electricity, security, and commercial viability. As a Glencore operation, Optimum surely cannot be perceived to be acting in the national interest. I see that you're smiling.
Yes. I shouldn't be.
Yes. It seems to me that once you conceded each and every of Eskom's demands and communicated them, and when I say you, I mean Glencore, you're representing them. Once you considered them at that point in time, you did something which Eskom did not expect. Because on Mr. Koko's approach, that was perplexing.
I don't understand the word perplexing in the context of the two preceding paragraphs, or in the context of the numerous occasions when Eskom laid out what it is they wanted. They have laid out in the numerous discussions and documents we've been through on numerous occasions what they wanted. They had got exactly what they wanted. So why one would be perplexed having stuck to a hard line and having received that hard line is inexplicable.
A hard bargainer like Eskom at that point in time would have been happy
Exactly right.
rather than being perplexed.
Very much so.
Yes. But I can understand why he would suggest that your change of stance was perplexing. Because from his explanation in that paragraph about the history of the engagement with Glencore, there was one important development which he does not refer to in this letter. And that is the attempts by Tegeta to acquire the mine. Because your change of stance at that point in time meant that the offer was no longer on the table, the mine was no longer available for sale.
Correct.
And that was a matter that perplexed him. I can't think of any other matter that could perplex him once you concede each and every demand Eskom was making.
I agree with you.
Well, he couldn't have been perplexed about the fundamental shift, the change, unless in insisting on the position on which Eskom was insisting rigidly on your evidence, unless he didn't expect the shift. Isn't it?
He should not have been perplexed in the slightest at the news that he heard on the 1st of December. He should have been overjoyed, and it should have been one of his KPIs for that year. If Eskom's position was to take a hard line, they had negotiated hard, and they had got one of the largest mining houses to effectively concede on each of their items. I don't understand the word perplexed in the context of this.
Well, I'm thinking that, let me talk in, not on the facts of this case. Let's say you have negotiations with somebody to settle something, some dispute, and you take a position that, for example, is intended by you to ensure there is no settlement, but there is capitulation. But you don't think capitulation is going to happen. And then if it happens, wouldn't you be perplexed?
If your stated intention is different from your actual intention.
Yeah, okay, all right.
Yes.
I'm not talking about this one.
In your example, you never wanted a settlement. You were seeking it as leverage for another example.
Yeah, okay.
And what he is saying in the paragraph I've just read, that's the last paragraph, he refers to the fact that there were threats of liquidation, and those threats of liquidation had a potentially negative impact on the supply of coal and therefore electricity to the country, and that you would not be acting in the best interest of the nation. But what is quite clear that by the time he writes this letter, there were no longer threats of liquidation of the mine, correct?
Correct.
In fact, the mine was going to be removed from business rescue.
Correct.
In fact, the mine was going to honor all of its CSA obligations, however oppressive.
Correct.
What reason can you think of that Mr. Koko does not disclose all the true facts? the little that he discloses is in fact a misrepresentation of the facts.
I don't think I can speculate on what Mr. Kaka was intending with this letter.
But from your perspective, do you accept that this statement relating to threats of liquidation, the possible impact of those threats of liquidation to the security of supply, were a clear misrepresentation of the facts?
Exactly right. Effective 1 December, that position no longer existed. Prior to that, before Glencore's about turn, that was a real possibility, but post the 1 December meeting, i.e. at the time this letter was drafted, that was no longer a realistic possibility.
In fact, Hendrina would continue to procure
Correct.
coal at its own requirements under the CSA.
Correct.
The only possibility that ESCOM may well have faced was the supply of coal which was not meeting the specs, but that would be dealt by with penalties.
In terms of the contract, yes.
Then I am paging over, Chair, to ES 1503.
Yes.
In parallel, you are aware that we have similar challenges at Arnott Power Station. The current supply contract with Exaro Resources expired on 31 December 2015, and we are discussing the winding down of operations with Exaro. Is there any comment you want to make? Just reading it in the interest of full disclosure.
I was not aware of it at the time.
But what you have been aware of in due course is that coal from Optimum was procured by Tegeta to supply Arnott.
Indeed.
We'll get to that in due course. The next paragraph reads as follows: while ESCOM has issued requests for proposals to the open market, the tender submissions indicate that we will not have sufficient volumes to meet the requirements for Arnott based on previous tests. ESCOM can confirm that the coal qualities at Optimum are suitable for Arnott's burn requirements and will pass the necessary combustion tests. Based on Optimum's current mine plans, there should be sufficient coal volume to service both power stations. Therefore, Optimum becomes highly sought after source for Arnott as well. Do you see that?
Yes.
This is not a sudden reflection of the importance of Optimum to ESCOM. It has always been there, historically, from day one. It has always been there when you took over as the BRPs. Correct?
Its historic importance and ongoing importance, absolutely.
Yes. So he is not telling the Director General anything new here.
He's not. A couple of these items, just reading it quickly, maybe require some clarification if you don't mind.
Yes.
Optimum's current mine plans, certainly at that point in time we were in control of the mine, and we had no plans to expand production beyond our obligations to Hendrina. Although when the mine was in full production and supplying to the export market, it would have had sufficient coal to supply it. So the first half of that, I suppose, is debatable. The second half, would we have sufficient volume? Yes. So once again, supporting your assertion that it's an important asset from an ESCOM perspective.
You know, Mr. Marsden, the sad part of this story, arising from this paragraph, is that Glencore was willing to keep an Optimum coal mine as part and parcel of a strategic supply to ESCOM for the rest of the CSA. In fact, it wanted to go even further. But that mine has now been lost altogether.
Yep.
Because the evidence before the chair is that that mine is a mine dump at the moment. Are you aware of that fact?
I'm aware it's undergoing its second business rescue process, and I don't believe it's currently in production.
Yes. And that's the sad reality of what Eskom is now facing.
Indeed.
Yes. The next paragraph reads as follows. I also put it to you that Komati Power Station received 180,000 tons per month of coal from Koornfontein Mine as a subsidiary of Optimum Coal Holdings. This contract expires at the end of January 2016. As a result of the rescue proceedings, this power station is also at risk post-January 2016. Do you understand what is communicating to the DG at that point in time?
I understand what he's miscommunicating to the DG.
Right.
I think that factually, Optimum Coal Holdings is in business rescue. Its subsidiary, Koornfontein Mines, is not. It is a separate legal entity. It has its own board. It has its own funding structure, and it is not in business rescue. So whilst I had representation as a shareholder, Koornfontein exists as a separate legal entity, not within business rescue and not at threat of either business rescue and or liquidation as well. The contract expires at the end of January 2016. I think that at least agrees to the date I just gave you. We had been requesting an extension on similar terms from Eskom. They were the ones who did not want to give the extension. If you go back to the previous page, on page 1502, the last sentence of the second last paragraph, they insisted that the extension of Koornfontein supply contract is at the discretion of Eskom. So the threat of Koornfontein sits very squarely on Eskom stores, not at Koornfontein stores. If you understand me.
I understand that. I mean, I have read a little of every available public information relating to the business rescue proceedings. I have never come across any evidence whatsoever suggesting that Koornfontein Mine was in or about to be put into business rescue. This is the first time I hear of it.
You're absolutely right. It was never at risk of being in business rescue.
Do you know any reason why Mr. Koko would miscommunicate this fundamental proposition to the Director General?
I do not.
The next paragraph reads as follows. As at the date of this letter, we have not yet received a formal notification of the status of Optimum. Is that true?
That is true, yes. We had not been able to achieve the governance required in order to discharge the business rescue.
The next paragraph reads as follows. While Eskom fully appreciates the turnaround of the business, it remains concerned that such erratic display of business stability may compromise the security of supply to Hendrina Power Station in the short to medium term. Therefore, Eskom would require a firm resolution on Optimum by mid-December 2015. Do you see that?
I do.
I don't know what firm resolution he was looking at by December 2015. But on what you have told the chairperson, it is quite clear that remaining disputes between Eskom and Optimum Coal Holdings relating to Optimum Coal Mine have been resolved.
I suppose they've been verbally agreed, but there's governance and paperwork that needs to support those decisions. So I can only anticipate that the formal discharge of business rescue is what was required in this paragraph, I assume.
Yeah, but that's a formality.
I mean, there's steps that need to be done, but yes.
Yes, but those are formal processes. They're not
Correct.
matters of substance.
No.
Yes. All right, we will leave that to Mr. Koko and we'll ask him. Maybe he will be able to tell us what was erratic about the remaining steps to bring about the formal rescue of the entity. The next paragraph reads as follows: the risk of security of supply for Hendrina Power Station, Komati Power Station, and Arnott Power Station is of such a key national interest that we thought it appropriate to bring it to your attention. This upcoming adversity facing Eskom will require some form of intervention on the part of the Department of Mineral Resources to assist Eskom in leveraging the necessary key authorities to assist in assuring resolution to the coal supply situation and certainly going forward. Can you think of any need for the Director General, his or her department, or even the executive authority of the department, being the Minister of Mineral Resources, would have to intervene in your contractual relationship with Eskom once you have conceded to its demands at the meeting of 1 December 2015?
I see no reason.
All right, we have dealt with the contents of this letter, and in fairness, you were not aware of them when Mr. Koko wrote to the Director General.
Correct.
Now that you are aware of them, what is the view you take of the contents of this letter?
I think it's quite disturbing in terms of where we had landed on the 1st of December, and to the extent that Eskom wished to play hardball on the contract, which was their prerogative, and they achieved that. I would have thought that would have been the end of the matter.
There were further developments which took place between Eskom, Glencore, Optimum Holdings, and yourself before Mr. Koko wrote this letter. And I'm talking about developments of the 1st of December, which were not disclosed in this letter. And I'd like to deal with them to the extent that you are aware of them. You begin to deal with them from page 15.
Yes, so to pick up where we were, we had just concluded the meeting with Mr. Koko at Eskom. And as I previously said, we had been asked to set up 2 meetings, one with Mr. Koko and the second with the consortium of banks. Mr. Efron excused himself from that meeting between driving from Megawatt Park to the banks. Shortly after, in early December, unfortunately I don't have the date, it was an informal session, Mr. Efron advised me that there was a meeting held in Switzerland, the principal terms of the transaction that had been agreed between Glencore, Oak Bay, and Tegeta, which included the sale of OCH's assets for a purchase consider of 2.15 billion, and the various terms of the offer. I was certainly not present at those meetings, and essentially we would have been required to consent to that transactions. We were in operational control, effectively in the shoes of the board of directors of OCH. So whilst the shareholders had agreed, we also needed to understand the transaction and consent thereto. We discussed the new offer with Glencore's representatives and Mr. Efron on his return to Johannesburg, and we were satisfied that the offer was significantly more than the 1 billion, and if there was the contribution of 400 million as proposed by Glencore, this would essentially deal with all of the stakeholders at OCH.
Yes.
The stakeholders at OCH being the bank consortium, being Eskom in terms of its contingent claim in terms of the guarantee, and Glencore representing the shareholders, and there were no staff at OCH being a holding company. So in the world of our affected parties, this ticked the boxes.
Yes. What is quite clear from Mr. Efron's evidence is that he was called to fly to Zurich on the 1st of December to attend a meeting, because on that date, the 1st of December, there was a meeting between Mr. Glassenberg and the Minister of mineral resources at that point in time. Are you aware of that meeting in Zurich between?
I have no personal knowledge, but yes, I'm aware of the
But
meeting.
we're not told of it.
I was not aware of it.
Okay.
No.
And then once he arrived at that meeting, he was told of, well, there was everyone there, the agreement was reached. And I assume that it was on the 2nd of December when an agreement was reached. When did you become aware that Zurich had struck a deal on the sale of the 3 assets?
I don't recall the exact date, but it would have been early in December, sometime immediately thereafter. I can only postulate that it would have been sometime between the 2nd or the 4th or the 5th.
All right. And then we know that as a result of that deal, there was some kind of the implementation of it.
Yes.
By means of the execution of the sale agreement.
Yes, that's right.
You refer to that sale agreement, Chair, at page 16,
Yes.
paragraph 46. And it begins at page 150. If you don't mind, I would like to take you to some of the terms of that sale. The first is part of the definition clauses. If I may ask you to go to page 158. And just to confirm with you, the sale agreement is on the letterhead, or at least the branding of Worksmans.
That's correct.
So Worksmans were quite busy.
They were indeed.
At page 158, paragraph 1.2.29, there is a definition of what a guarantee is. Do you see that?
I do.
Okay. The guarantee executed by the seller in favor of Eskom on 6 April 2008, in terms of which the seller guaranteed the performance of OCM, the performance by OCM of all of its obligations in terms of the CSA, correct?
Yes.
Yes. So as I understand, independent of the CSA, there will be a guarantee put up by OCH,
That's correct.
to make sure that OCM fulfills all of its obligations.
That's correct.
In the event of breach, Eskom can rely on that guarantee.
Yes.
Okay. Against that background, I'm going to take you to page 168, which deals with suspensive conditions. And the key ones which you would be aware of begin at page 169, paragraph 3.1.3. Do you see that?
Yes.
It says by the 31st of March 2016, the sale agreement ought to be approved by the lenders, which is the banks, the competition authorities, which is the Competition Commission, failing which the Competition Tribunal, and upway through the Competition Appeal Court in case of litigation. And then the Minister of Mineral Resources in terms of Section 11 of the MPRDA, correct?
Absolutely.
We will come back to this, and some of them I'll raise them with Dr. Ramucha when he comes in. Because those were contractual obligations imposed on someone who had to take initiative to make sure that these obligations were fulfilled.
Yes.
Do you know who was supposed to shoulder the obligations to ensure fulfillment of these?
Generally, in agreements of this nature, it's both parties would use their endeavors to make sure that the conditions precedent are met.
Well, can I take you to page 172?
Yes.
you will see that there is clause 5, which deals with regulatory filings. 5.1.1, it is recorded that the proposed transaction shall, on implementation, constitute a large merger for the purposes of the Competition Act. And we know that a large merger is notifiable
Yes,
by the parties to that measure. Correct?
absolutely.
5.1.2, the purchaser shall be responsible for preparing and lodging on behalf of the parties as soon as reasonably possible after the signature date. Requisite measure filings for the proposed transaction in accordance with the provisions of the Competition Act. It seems to me that the obligation to file notification for the transaction is placed on Together as the proposed purchaser.
That's correct.
Yes. If you go to page 173, paragraph 5.2, section 11 application, the purchaser shall be responsible for preparing and lodging on behalf of the parties as soon as reasonably possible after the signature date, the application in accordance with the requirements of section 11. So again, the agreement makes it quite clear that it is Together who must initiate those processes.
I would agree.
Yes. Of course, I accept that it does it on behalf of the party, but it is the one which must procure by making the applications.
I mean, I think there's a slight distinction between procuring the entire CP and submitting of documents. So
It is
I
the
don't want to
one.
contradict myself. They are certainly responsible for that.
I-
But both parties are responsible for ensuring that the CP is met.
I take your point. It is the one that has to initiate.
Initiate, correct, yes.
Yes. Now, we have looked at one set of the suspensive conditions. There were additional suspensive conditions which are set out in 169, paragraph 3.1.4. On or before 31 March 2016, the purchaser shall have obtained in a form and substance reasonably acceptable to the seller and the purchaser the irrevocable and unconditional consent of ESCOM. Do you see that?
Yes,
And release by ESCOM of the ESCOM guarantee. Do you see that?
yes,
So it seems when I look at that, again, the obligation is on Together to procure ESCOM's consent to the deal.
that's correct.
The obligation is also on Together to make sure that Optimum Coal Holdings is released from the guarantee.
That's right.
Correct? But the last issue which I'd like to look at on this agreement is the calculation of the purchase price at page 175. Do you see that?
I've got it, yes.
It is disaggregated into different components. You will see that insofar as the sale of shares and claim in Korenfontein, there is an amount of 340 million rand which is designated as a purchase price. Do you agree?
Yes,
Okay. And you'll see that insofar as the sale of shares in Korenfontein is concerned, I think the price is 1 rand.
that's correct.
And then insofar as the sale of the claims in OCT, the profitable entity is concerned, the purchase price is 140 million rand. I ask you this because as an accountant, if you were to account in the books of the seller the value for these things, you will start firstly with the purchase price.
Yes,
And thereafter you can value it and do your own financial engineering. But on date one of purchase, as you account for these assets, you'll say, well, a purchase price is a fair value.
yes.
All right. And then I would ask you to go to page 227, paragraph 12. It deals with the rehabilitation trust. It's a matter that is of interest to you, and you will debate it later on because you deal with it in the concluding part of your statement.
Yes.
It records that there have been some investments held in the rehabilitation trust for both Optimum and Fontaine. And those investments at that point in time, as at 31 January 2016, reflected a cash positive or cash equivalent balance of 1.75 billion rand. Correct?
So this agreement was signed on the 10th of December, and this is effectively stating that by the 31st of January 2016, some month and a half later, the aggregate value of those two should be no less than 1.750 and be held in cash and or cash equivalents.
Yes. So what it anticipates is that whereas you as Glencore would have arranged those investments differently, by this date, a cash or cash equivalent had to be in a trust account held for the benefit of the trusts.
That's right. Just remember, the Optimum coal mine is simply a beneficiary to the trust.
Oh, yes.
The trustees determine into which assets they would like those funds to be invested.
Yes.
And the trustees, in terms of this agreement, took it out of long-term assets and put it into cash or cash
Into
equivalents.
cash, yes. All right, I have completed my evidence relating to this agreement. Unless you want to say something about it, I'll take you back to your statement.
No, I'm fine, thank you.
You deal with the fulfillment of the conditions precedent at page 16. And you talk about your concerns concerning question marks around the ability of Tegeta to fund the purchase price in paragraph 48.1.
Yes.
All I want to ask you there is why were you concerned that Tegeta would not have the ability to fund the purchase price at that point in time?
They were not a publicly traded organization, so financial information was not available to us. It is a substantial amount of cash. They had given us assurances that they had the means with which to meet their obligations, but we wanted to see something beyond verbal or written assurances.
And you said the banks also required something more.
Yeah, absolutely. So the banks, we've just dealt with the conditions precedent, one of which was the banking consortium, which held the security, was required to consent to the transaction. And in my discussions with the bank consortium, that was one of their fundamental components, is if we go down this particular path, we need to make sure that when we get to the end, the party has sufficient funds in order to meet their obligation. And they had a very specific format and delivery mechanism that they wanted.
Which was?
Via the SWIFT system. They wanted very specific language around proof of funding, and in order to ensure the veracity and the custody, they wanted that letter to be delivered via the SWIFT system, which is a secure banking system as far as I understand.
Yes. SWIFT is something that makes sure that when you put in and lock in payment, it gets swept quite quickly. There's no debate about whether the money has gone in or not. You know, and that's why they call it SWIFT. It's very swift.
It's very swift, yeah.
Okay, but in the end, the bank could not get a letter secured by a SWIFT payment system.
No. What was delivered, once again, unfortunately, I don't have the exact date, but sometime after the 10th of December agreement was signed and prior to the end of that month, we had a meeting with the bank consortium, as well as with representatives of Tegeta, and a letter on the letterhead of the Bank of Baroda was presented to us. We were not allowed to retain a copy. We were not allowed to otherwise duplicated. And it essentially recorded, I don't have the wording because we don't have a copy, that in the event that all the conditions precedent are met, the company would have sufficient to discharge the 2.15 odd billion that was their portion of the purchase price.
In paragraph 48.2, you refer to a letter that you received from the Bank of Baroda.
Yes.
It is at page 275, Chair.
Yes. So this was
Thank you.
very similar to the letter that we had been shown in late December. We eventually got a copy of, and I can't recall if it's an identical letter for obvious reasons, but it appears to be very similar to the letter that we were shown in December.
Yes. This is, well, the first time that the Bank of Baroda commits itself to funding of the purchase price on behalf of Tegeta.
Well, they'd committed to it in December,
Yes.
but we weren't able to retain a copy of it.
I understand, but this is the letter that you annex here.
Yes,
It's a letter that you ultimately got,
that is correct.
and you say you got it around the 3rd of March 2016, I think.
I think it's dated the 4th of March. It must have been around then.
Yes. And what I want to understand is, did you manage to establish why the Bank of Baroda would be so confident to guarantee payment of 2.15 billion rand
No,
on behalf of Tegeta?
we took it as read that there were sufficient funds to do it.
There has been some anecdotal evidence that the Bank of Baroda was prepared to do this because by this time, Eskom had put up a 1.7 billion rand guarantee at ABSA for the benefit of Tegeta. Are you aware of such evidence?
I'm aware of them now. I wasn't obviously at the time.
Okay. Chair, I'm not going to ask Mr. Marsden to deal with the contents of the letter because it essentially repeats the relevant suspensive conditions that we have dealt with.
Yes.
Unless you insist, Mr. Marsden, I would move away from that letter.
I think the only point perhaps that I could add to it is that that letter did not satisfy the banking consortium. So that CP ultimately wasn't met. How that was dealt with was, given that the banks would be settled in full, the legal opinion was you no longer required their consent. So that particular condition precedent was waived rather than being met.
Yes.
They were unsatisfied with that letter, given that it hadn't come through the protocols
Yes.
that they requested.
Yes. The structure of payment, as I understand, is that the agreement established an escrow agent, which was Worksman's,
That's correct.
and it is the one which was going to receive payment and confirm by a specific date that monies have been paid both by Optimum Holdings for its portion and also Ogbe for its portion.
Amongst various statutory documents, directors' resignations, company books and records. So they acted as the repository for what everybody had to deliver, including, importantly, of course, the cash.
And their view about the compliance of that part of the agreement was quite key.
Yes.
Yes. I mean, you deal with all of those things, Mr. Marsden, from paragraph, I think, page 50, sorry, paragraph 50 on page 18. I'd like to move quite quickly.
Yes, of course.
You say in paragraph 51, on the 11th of April, you had a telephone call from Mr. Hoa.
Yes.
What did he say to you?
So contextually, this was post all the conditions being met, and essentially the clock was ticking for the funds to arrive, as you mentioned, in the escrow agreement. Mr. Hauer mentioned to me that they were short on their contribution, i.e. they did not have sufficient funds to meet their obligation, which was due in 2 or 3 days' time, given that the contract CPs had been met. And he requested me to see if the bank consortium would allow the transaction to close and effectively bridge them for the 600 million rand that they were short.
What I find surprising is this, that they had already displayed to you a letter from the Bank of Baroda which says that we are good for 2.15 billion. And that was around, what, April or March?
March, the 4th of March.
Yes. I mean, his bank has already said we are good for the money. And more or less 3 weeks later, he tells you that, look, we are short to the extent of a third of the purchase price.
I was equally surprised.
Okay. Did he explain to you why they were short?
He did not.
You did not ask him about the undertaking by the Bank of Baroda?
We did, he didn't give us an explanation.
Must have worried you by that point in time.
I think so.
Yes. And then you arranged a meeting with the consortium of banks, and they said no, they were not prepared to fund the shortfall.
Exactly right.
And what happened thereafter?
I told that message, I took that message back to Mr. Hauer, and then we sat back and waited for the funds to arrive or not arrive.
And I'm sure you must have been worried.
We were extremely worried.
Yes. And did you get a call from Waxmans?
I was on the call with the bank that held the accounts, and we saw the funds coming in tranches, live, essentially. Yeah, and the full purchase price came in.
Were you able to track from which banks were the funds transmitted?
I do not have that information.
You don't have that information?
No.
Okay. What is quite clear is that Eskom advanced a prepayment to Carte under a prepayment agreement for the supply of coal. The total amount that Eskom paid under that prepayment agreement was 669 odd million rand, VAT inclusive.
Yes.
There is a substantial controversy around that prepayment, and I'm sure you are aware of it.
Yes, in fact, when we were watching, and it is covered, so I don't know if
We'll get to it.
the 34, yeah.
All I wanted to find out is, when did you become aware of that prepayment?
On a Carte Blanche episode.
Not
some weeks after the transaction had closed.
some weeks after the transaction.
Maybe even some months after, yes.
Okay. Right. I am going to ask you to go back to your statement.
Yes.
And in paragraph 55 on page 19, you confirm that Worksmans, as the escrow agent, did confirm that the money was paid.
Exactly right.
Yes. And then
The full extent of the purchase price.
to the full extent, yeah, which is 2.15 billion rand.
That's correct.
Good. Then you talk about the discharge of OCM the discharge of OCH from business rescue. So that's the parent company.
Yes, it no longer has any assets or any liabilities,
Yes.
so it's effectively.
Yes. And you say it was discharged on 15 April 2016?
That's correct.
Yes. Nothing substantial turns around it.
No.
Then you talk about the funding of OCM by Carte and the sale of coal to Carte. And this topic arises in the context of the fact that although the sale agreement was executed, the change of ownership had not yet become effective.
No, the change of ownership was effective, but the legal entity remained in business rescue. So the entity itself has its own liabilities, its own creditors, so we remained in control of the legal entity. Its shareholders had simply changed.
Oh, I see. So it was still in business rescue, and that's why you were present on the ground.
And that's why we were in operational
All
control,
right.
exactly right.
All right. So you were controlling the business.
That's right.
Okay. And you talk about that question of the sale of coal to Carte from paragraph 60. correct?
Yes.
Can I ask you to summarize that topic for us?
Sure. So even prior to the close of the transaction, as catered for in the agreement which we've been to the conditions precedent, there was a requirement from 1 January 2016 that any shortfall, as we've discussed, there is a substantial shortfall at OCM, would be required to be funded by Tegeta Oak Bay. So there was a post-commencement finance agreement that was put in place, and essentially any shortfalls in the mine from the period of January until the transaction closed would have to be funded by Tegeta. We did that, and we were able to extract a number of draws. What happened concurrently with that is the mine was designed or to operate to produce just enough coal to meet the obligations of Hendrina. However, from a risk perspective, you tend to produce slightly more in the event of any stoppage or anything else. So on an ad hoc basis, there was additional coal available for sale, and even prior to this in 2015, any surplus coal that we had, we sold out into the open market, notably to Glencore in previous to 2015. However, in 2016, from sometime in mid-January, we had two competing bids for that surplus coal, and Tegeta were able to offer more for that coal than Glencore. The impact of that being it reduced their funding obligation in terms of the PCF.
Yeah.
So there is both a sale of coal, the proceeds of which gets paid to OCM, which then subsequently reduces the need for post-commencement finance.
In fact, I suggest to you that Tegeta has benefited twice as a result of your supply of coal to them. Because on the one hand, they buy coal from you as Optimum coal mine, and they pay you, and that is part and parcel of their obligation to fund you under the post-commencement finance agreement, correct?
That's correct.
And to the extent that they take that coal to the market, we know that they took it to Arnold. Are you aware of that fact?
Yes, I am.
And they sold it to Arnold at prices higher than you would have sold to Hendrina.
I understand.
And that were higher rates.
Yes.
So they were benefiting twice.
I certainly understand your logic. In the event that they ultimately were the acquirers of OCM, that kind of would come out in the wash, because the first pocket of benefit is a funding obligation. It's not either a profit or a loss. But I understand your logic absolutely.
No, Mr. Mazden. Absent the supply of coal to them, they would have had to search in their pockets to fund.
Absolutely.
I mean, at that level, they're buying coal to reduce their financial exposure.
That's correct.
Yes. Anyway, we have dealt with the issue of the post-finance agreement. You refer to it in paragraph 62.
Yes.
Chair, it is part and parcel of the annexures. I'm not going to take Mr. Mazden there.
Yeah.
And then you explain what happened thereafter, and you talk about your discussion with Mr. Gert Opperman about the Hendrina coal requirements at paragraph 64.
Yes, so it wasn't a discussion, it was an email.
Okay.
We, as I mentioned, you produce just enough coal to satisfy the obligations, and if there's surplus, you put that out into the open market. But clearly your primary obligation is to ensure that you first supply to Hendrina. So we were requested to supply more than I thought was available out of that equation. And I sent an email to the mine manager at the time to say, but do we have sufficient product on the floor to enter into a third-party sale? And the response that we got is recorded in the email from Mr. Optimum, whereby by Hendrina not taking their full obligation, that obviously made excess available for us to sell to third parties.
Yes. Chair, the email is at page 318.
Okay, I've got it. Thank you.
Are you aware that sometime before December 2015, Mr. Opperman sought to motivate to his superiors, and ultimately the board of ESCOM, to authorize additional supply of coal during what you call the festive seasons?
I'm not aware, no.
You're not aware of that? Okay, I will not trouble you with it then. It seems to me that you have dealt with the issues of the post-finance supply agreement up to page 23, paragraph 74 of your statement.
Yes.
You begin with the question of rehabilitation funds from...
Sorry, Mr. Maleka, can I just raise one issue that I think is important before we do that? I'm referring to paragraph 72.
72.
72, because this impacts when it comes to the discussion around the prepayment, which we no doubt will get to.
Yes.
Then once again, dates being fundamentally important. The supply of contract, a draft unsigned, was dated the 21st of April 2016, and this related to the ongoing supply and the material terms of that supply beyond that date, which was, in other words, post Glencore having exited as the shareholder, but now to coming in as the shareholder.
Yes.
So that may be relevant for later, so I just wanted to highlight that.
But my recollection is that although the agreement was not signed, the parties behaved as if it was effective.
Agreed, but the date at which the party started to bring effect to that agreement is the 21st of April.
Okay. Unless you have any other further qualifications, with speed, I'd like to go to the rehabilitation funds.
Yes.
Yes. You deal with that topic from paragraph 77, correct?
That's correct.
We have looked at what the agreement said in that regard. We have looked at what the agreement contemplated in terms of the balance that had to be in the rehabilitation funds by the 31st of January 2016. And you say in paragraph 78 that when you took appointment as BRPs, the amount standing to the credit of the funds was 1.456 billion rand, correct?
That's right.
And it was invested in Standard Bank.
When we took control as BRP, it was invested in a number of different instruments. It was then converted to cash.
Yes.
At this point, that was sitting in one lump sum in a bank account.
Yes, no, I understand that. So it had been converted as a result of the clause in the agreement.
Correct.
And it's sitting in Standard Bank's account.
That is correct.
I think you were here yesterday when Mr. Sinton testified.
I was.
You heard this evidence?
I did.
Is there any aspect of it that you would want to detail, qualify, or elaborate on?
No.
I mean, your evidence is fairly consistent with what he said.
I hope so.
Yes. In terms of the desire by Tegeta to get hold of the funds, to transfer them into a different bank account.
Absolutely.
And you heard his explanation that he needed authority from the trustees, he needed authority from the DMR.
Yes, I think maybe the only thing to add is further to that point, we were equally distressed when we were made aware of that request. We were in the unfortunate position of being in control of the beneficiary of the trust. So we were in charge of OCM, who was the beneficiary of the trust on behalf of the DMR, but we were not the trustees. Those were appointed by Tegeta. We also faced a further problem in that with the closure of the bank accounts, that 1.45 billion had to go somewhere. And so we were particularly concerned around where it would go, the manner in which it would be managed and handled by the trustees. And so we sent a variety of documents to whoever would listen to us at the time in order to try our best to ensure that those funds remained intact.
Yes. My reading of your statement is that you were so concerned about the fate of the trust funds to a point where you escalated this issue with the Tegeta representatives to insist that they should tell you which bank was going to hold those funds?
I think we did a lot more than that. Certainly that was one aspect. We wanted the bank account to be in the name of the Rehabilitation Trust as a starting point. Which bank it is in is perhaps less important than the name on the bank account. I think we requested assurances from the bank itself. We had a meeting with the bank whereby we walked them through our understanding of what the purpose of those trust funds were and what the intention.
When you say the bank, you say the Bank
of
of
Baroda.
Yes.
Absolutely. That was the nominated bank that
Yes.
sorry, I missed that point, that they had done. We insisted that the trustees, as appointed by Tegeta, gave us assurances around their understanding of the trust funds, etc. So, you know, we sent a letter to the Reserve Bank.
And that's the
Bank
point.
of
You
Baroda.
escalated the matter even to the
As
Reserve
much
Bank.
as possible.
Yes.
That's correct, yes.
Why were you so much concerned about the fate of the trust funds to a point where you even involved the engagement of SAB to deal with the matter?
I think we were very distressed by the request from Tegeta to withdraw that Mr. Sinton testified to yesterday, to withdraw the funds to this unknown entity. And we were concerned that if we didn't act, there was the possibility that they may try again.
Do you know that there was litigation commenced by one of the NGOs, if I'm not mistaken, I think it was Organization for Undoing Tax Outer, against the trustees and some entities in the Ogbe stable.
I'm aware
About
of it.
allegations of abuse of the trust fund. Are you aware of that litigation?
Not in detail, I'm aware that it exists.
Okay.
I think the public protector also made some findings with regards to commingling of funds in her report as well.
So what you feared then ultimately led to litigation.
Yes.
So it seems as if you knew something more at that point in time when you were trying to make sure that the funds of the trusts are secure.
I think I'm a professional cynic as a start, but certainly the actions of Ms. Raghavan, as highlighted by Mr. Sinton, would have heightened those concerns.
Okay. All right. You deal with the next topic, which is the Carte Blanche story at page 28, paragraph 94 of your statement. Chair, I see it's already past 4. I think we're reaching the conclusion of Mr. Marsden's evidence.
Yes, no, I think we can finish.
You can finish.
Yeah.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you.
You deal with it from paragraph 94.
Yes.
What gave rise to your concerns immediately after you watched this episode of Carte Blanche?
So there were 2 episodes across 2 weeks that were aired by investigative journalists and specifically Carte Blanche, and a number of articles following up on that. There was also a full-length interview with Mr. Hauer, which was available on the website, and obviously, given our interest, I watched those. And pursuant to the interview, I learned for the first time that Eskom had actually made a prepayment to Tegeta for the purchase of coal from Tegeta in an amount of 586, excluding VAT. And the coal for which the prepayment was made appeared to have been or was procured from Optimum coal mine. I came to learn from the episodes, the interviews, and the articles that the prepayment was approved by a committee of Eskom late in the evening at 9 o'clock on the 11th of April, coincidentally the same date that I had been requested to ask the banks for the bridging finance and for a very similar amount. So pursuant to the interview, Mr. Hauer also remarked that the prepayment had been made on the basis that OCM, which was in BR and therefore under my control, required money for his liquidity, which was factually inaccurate, and for the startup of equipment, which was also inaccurate. The prepayment was not made to OCM. We did not receive any prepayment. And from April 2016, in fact, the coal that we supplied to Tegeta, that they supplied, was actually on a 30-day payment terms as well. So the events surrounding the prepayment came as a surprise in terms of the quantum and in terms of the timing, with the knowledge that I had of the meeting of 11th of April. And in that context, myself and my fellow practitioner submitted a report in terms of 34.
Yes. I'd like to establish some few facts from you in relation to immediately what you learned from the episodes of Carte Blanche.
Yes.
By the time you conclude the sale agreement, Mr. Hoa was someone that was well known to you.
Yes.
Even thereafter, it was someone that was known to you, correct?
Absolutely.
Did you have any engagements with him as the representative of the new owner?
Extensive, yes.
In any of those engagements, did he disclose to you that there were negotiations relating to prepayment
No.
between Tegeta and Eskom?
No.
Did he ever disclose to you that Tegeta would approach Eskom to talk about any funds relating to the operational requirements of OCM?
No.
Why do you think that he would go to Carte Blanche and say things about OCM which he did not talk to you? It must have been obvious to him that you would be amongst persons who have the primary knowledge of the true facts,
I presume so.
and that when he goes public around misstatements of fact, you would obviously reveal the true set of facts, as you did.
I would hope so.
What would be the reason for him to do so? I'm asking you an unfair question, but you are the only person who can help us for now.
I think that they may have been caught by surprise at the fact that the prepayment was made. And the fact that that was then publicly available may have caught them off guard. And in an attempt to justify it, maybe complicated the issue with the statement of misfacts.
You know, what I find surprising with this, and maybe it should be a proposition I put on the table, Chair, is that this project of state capture goes about making public statements that are untrue in the light of information which is captured on documentation, as if this information would not at some point become public. Because I don't understand from the example that we are dealing with, that Mr. Hoa would know that you are a BRP, essentially a public representative in a company that is in financial distress, and that you have the facts at your disposal, and yet you'll go about making statements publicly that are untrue. I really don't understand how he would have expected that a public representative such as you would keep quiet once the untruths are told by him in public.
I can't answer that, unfortunately.
Yes. All right. You can't answer that, but what you can answer is your last leg of the BRP process.
Yes.
You deal with it in page 30, paragraph 101.
Yes, so effective in mid-April, OCH was discharged. We had new shareholders at OCM, but OCM itself remained in business rescue until it could satisfy practitioners that it was no longer financially distressed. And the test in that regard is a 6-month test.
Yes.
In terms of the Companies Act, that it will reasonably able to meet its obligations as they fall due in the ensuing 6 months. We requested, therefore, a couple of things had to be achieved in order to satisfy that requirement. Number one, all of the pre-commencement creditors, i.e. the creditors who were stuck in the moratorium from the date of business rescue, needed to be satisfied in the absence of a plan. So we ensured that all of those creditors had either been paid or signed settlement agreements. The second test is that the 6-month looking test. So we interrogated the financial forecast that was provided to us by Tegeta. It did show a shortfall, not as big as the numbers that we had done, largely as a result of the increasing supply of excess coal to Tegeta. And we ensured that we had confirmation from the bank that they had the resources to meet that shortfall, and they subordinated all of their claims in favor of other creditors. And in that context, we deemed that OCM was no longer financially distressed. Sorry, one important point, the issue of the 2 billion rand fine, we believed that an arbitration proceeding would not be resolved within the ensuing 6 months, and therefore it did not fall within the jurisdiction of the 6-month test. So on that basis, we deemed that the company was no longer financially distressed, and we discharged it from business rescue.
All right. The two concluding points that I would like to raise with you. The first is that it is now clear that the penalties, the 2.1 billion rand arbitration claim, were ultimately settled between Eskom and Tegeta at about 255 million rand. Are you aware of that fact?
I've heard about it, yes.
Okay. As the BRPs, you did not have the occasion to assess and value a reasonable estimate of the penalties, did you?
No, we didn't.
Okay. The next thing is, you know that Optimum coal mine experienced a second business rescue process.
Is experiencing, I think, still.
Okay. Fair enough. It is still in business rescue. Do you know the grounds on which it was put in business rescue?
I do not.
Okay. I think you have indicated that the mine is no longer operational.
I can suspect, sorry, I've just had a thought. I think the rationale given, and I've not seen the sworn statement, but from the press reports, I believe it's as a result of the closure of the bank accounts as the purported reason.
Yes. You're correct. The reason is that it could not operate because the bank accounts were closed. But we had evidence that this mine is no longer operational. Are you aware of that fact?
I am.
Okay. From your knowledge, what's happening to that mine?
I have no direct knowledge of what's happened, but of course I keep my ear relatively close to the ground. And my understanding is that given the financial constraints it's faced, it is not in the condition that it was in when we discharged it from business rescue.
Chair, that would be the end of our questions to Mr. Marsden.
Thank you very much, Mr. Marsden. Should we require you again, you will be contacted, but for now you are excused.
With pleasure, thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much.
Chair, I take it that Mr. Marsden is relieved for going back to Canada. He's on a flight tonight. We won't need him.
Oh, yeah. It would be quite expensive to require him.
Yes.
Yes, no, thank you. You are excused. Thank you for coming. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
I'm both relieved and relieved.
Chair, the next witness is Dr. Ramuncha.
Yes.
I see that it is.
And he was ready.
He was ready since yesterday. We released him. He has been here, and he has been kind enough and tolerant to accommodate us.
Yes. How much time do we need for him?
Chair, I think even if I were to start today, I won't finish. But I'm aware that tomorrow you have other things. I won't need more than an hour.
Oh, you won't need more than an hour?
Yes.
How is his situation? Is he?
I believe that he's here and is represented.
Yes. In terms of tomorrow?
Oh, he indicates that he will accommodate us once again.
Yes, okay, okay. No, that's fine. Maybe we should, well, if we start, we are scheduled to start at 9:30 in terms of the arrangement for this week.
Yes. We can start at 9.
Which is likely to go on for some time. I'm thinking that maybe we should start at 9, but it depends on whether we'll be able to use the rest of the day fully, number one. Number two, whether Dr. Ramunja, he wishes to finish and rush, or whether he will be more or less quite flexible in case we start at 9:30. He can still be around until we have finished in an hour or an hour and a half's time. I have a suspicion he won't mind.
Chair, would you accommodate us if we start at 9 with a view to finish at 10?
I'm thinking I'm thinking about that, but I would like not to do that unless the situation compels us to. Maybe let me start by saying, and I see Ms. Norman is looking at you and at me, what is the situation about the rest of the day? I know we have a witness that's scheduled for tomorrow, but is he likely to take the whole day?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Pretorius SC had indicated that we might have a few hours available to us if we do not finish with some of the ESCOM witnesses tomorrow. He doesn't think that he will take the whole day with the witness for tomorrow.
Yes. Mr. Pretorius?
Mr. Pretorius, yes.
Okay, how many witnesses other than, apart from Dr. Ramunja, are we looking at for tomorrow?
For tomorrow, only one, as far as I understand. Only Dr. Ramunja, yes.
Hmm?
Only Dr. Ramunja. Oh, and also Minister Nene tomorrow? That's the witness, yes. But according to him, he offered in the morning that if there is one witness that you can't finish today, we will have time for that witness tomorrow.
Yeah, but do we know how long Mr. Nene is likely to be?
Not the entire day, according to Mr. Mukwena.
Not the entire day.
No, yes.
Well, then in that event, I would only say we start at 9 o'clock if Dr. Ramunja would be inconvenienced a lot if we started at 9:30 and finished 10:30, 11 or thereabouts. Yes. Maybe he might be able, or if he's represented, somebody might indicate. Do you want to come forward and indicate?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, Chair.
Good afternoon, yes.
Komar Ramunja from Komar Ramunja Tennis on behalf of Dr. Ramunja.
Yes.
I have consulted with Dr. Ramunja. We don't have a problem. Either we start at 9 o'clock or half past
9, there's no problem.
We're comfortable with any time.
Okay, no, thank you very much.
For the commission.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Okay, then in that event, let's start at 9:30.
Thank you, Chair.
Tomorrow. We'll adjourn the proceedings for today, and we will start at 9:30 tomorrow morning. We adjourn.